I am 76 years old, and most mornings begin the same way, though the silence in my kitchen feels heavier with each passing year. I rise slowly, not because my body is so frail that it cannot respond, but because I have learned that once I stand up and face the day, there is no one waiting for me, no voice calling from another room, no soft footsteps of a partner moving about the house. My wife, Ellen, passed 8 years ago, a sudden heart failure that left me stunned and hollow, like a tree struck in the middle of summer, green one moment and lifeless the next. Since that day, my home has felt like a museum of ordinary objects, a coffee pot, a worn recliner, framed photographs of our younger days, each of them a reminder that time keeps moving even when the people who gave meaning to it have gone. I live in the same farmhouse where I was born, on a patch of land in Iowa that has seen more winters than I care to count. Acres of soil that once gave me calloused hands, a sturdy back, and the pride of feeding a family. Now the land is leased to a neighbor, and I spend my days tending a small garden, mending tools, and sitting in the porch swing that groans under my weight like an old friend sharing my aches. When people ask how I am doing, I usually say I am fine because no one wants the truth, not really. The truth is that growing old feels like being erased slowly from the pages of a book. The story goes on, but the ink fades where your name used to be. I used to believe that age brought respect, that a man who worked hard and sacrificed for his family would be honored in the autumn of his life. My own father, a stern and quiet man, was treated with deference in his later years, and neighbors looked to him for wisdom. But the world has shifted, and I often feel like an artifact, interesting enough to be glanced at, but not necessary for the future. People drive past me on the road without a wave, young clerks in stores speak to me with a rehearsed patience, and even in my own family, I sometimes wonder if I am regarded less as a father and more as a burden that clings to life longer than expected. I have one son, Mark, my only child, who lives about an hour away in Des Moines. He built himself a life in the city, a career in finance, and a home with his wife, a woman who measures life in square footage and brand names. I was proud of him once, proud that the long hours I spent bent over the earth, the decades of thrift and self-denial, had allowed him to attend college and escape the limits of farm life. Ellen and I drove him to campus when he was 18, our old pickup loaded with boxes, his mother crying quietly the whole ride. I told him then, "You'll have more chances than I ever did. Don't waste them." He promised he wouldn't, and I believed him. In many ways, he kept that promise. He became successful, respected, and he provides well for his family. But success can be a cold shelter if it leaves no room for gratitude, and sometimes when I look at him, I no longer see the boy who once tugged at my sleeve in church, asking if we could go fishing after the sermon. I see a man who avoids my eyes as if my presence reminds him of something he would rather forget. The truth is that our relationship has been strained for many years, though I rarely admit it aloud. After Ellen died, I thought Mark would come around more often, that he would see how much I needed company, how much the house echoed without her laughter. At first he did, bringing his wife and children for Sunday dinners, but those visits became fewer until they stopped altogether. Now I see him mostly when there is some business matter to discuss, or when he wants to check that I am still managing. He always asks in the same clipped way, "How are you doing, Dad? Everything okay here?" as if I were a tenant reporting to a landlord. He looks around the house, notices the dust on the shelves, the peeling paint on the barn, and shakes his head. He tells me I should sell the place, move into assisted living, let go of the responsibilities that he thinks weigh me down. He says it like he's offering a kindness, but underneath it I hear a different message. You are old. You are unnecessary. You are in the way of what comes next. I try not to resent him. I tell myself he has his own life, his own pressures, a wife who expects a certain standard of living, children who drain his patience and his wallet. I remind myself that every generation is different, and maybe it is natural for a son to look at his father and see only decline. But there are moments, quiet, piercing moments, when his words echo in my chest like an insult I cannot scrub away. Once, after helping me fix the porch steps, he brushed the sawdust from his hands and muttered, "You can't keep this up forever. You're just waiting to die here." He said it casually, almost like a joke, but I felt the weight of it settle over me like a shroud, just waiting to die, as if my life were already finished, as if the days I still lived through had no worth except as a countdown to my disappearance. That phrase gnawed at me in the nights that followed. I would sit in the kitchen with a cup of weak coffee, staring at the dark window, hearing the wind creak through the eaves, and I would repeat it silently, just waiting to die. Was that all he saw when he looked at me? Not the years of sweat I poured into this land, not the sacrifices Ellen and I made to pay his tuition, not the sleepless nights when I sat by his bed while he burned with fever, praying he would live. All of it reduced to a tired old man taking up space. It was not the thought of death that unsettled me. I have made peace with the fact that my days are fewer ahead than behind. But the thought that my own son had already buried me in his heart, that he saw me as an obstacle rather than a father. The loneliness grew sharper after that. Neighbors would stop by now and then asking if I needed anything, and I would smile and say no, though what I really needed was something they could not give, the comfort of being wanted. My routines became smaller, as if I were shrinking to fit the life that remained to me. I walked the same paths around the farm, tended the same patch of tomatoes, fed the stray cats that lingered near the barn. In the evenings I would sit with old photo albums, running my fingers over the faces of people long gone. Ellen in her wedding dress, Mark as a child clutching a wooden toy I carved, family picnics under the elm tree that no longer stands. The house was quiet, except for the ticking of the clock, and sometimes I wondered if silence could wear a man down the way rain wears down stone. Still I endured, because endurance is what I know. A farmer does not abandon the field when the weather turns cruel. He waits, he adjusts, he trusts that the soil will give again. I told myself I could survive this stage of life with dignity, even if respect was no longer offered. I told myself I could be content with memories, with small tasks, with the simple act of waking up each morning and breathing air that still smelled of grass and earth. I told myself these things because I had to, because the alternative was despair. And yet beneath it all, there was a quiet ember of anger that refused to die out, a sense that something had been stolen from me, not my youth, not even my health, but the right to be seen as a man rather than a relic. I am not just waiting to die. I am waiting for something else, though I did not yet know what. Perhaps for a moment when my son's arrogance would be exposed, when the balance of power would shift, when the years of being dismissed would be answered by something undeniable. Perhaps I was waiting for my own chance to remind him, and myself, that even an old man still has choices, still has dignity, still has the power to act. That thought flickered in me like a half-forgotten instinct, a hunter's alertness, and though I pushed it aside at first, it grew stronger each time Mark looked at me with that detached impatience. So this is where I begin. An old man in an old farmhouse, surrounded by memories, spoken to as if I were already gone, dismissed by the one person who should remember most vividly what I gave. My life has been reduced in his eyes to a countdown, but in my own heart I feel something else stirring. He thinks I am waiting to die. He does not know what I am truly waiting for. It was late autumn when the real rupture began, though looking back I can see the signs were there long before, like cracks spreading silently through a foundation. Mark had called me out of the blue, his voice brisk, telling me that his family wanted me to come to their house for dinner on Saturday. The invitation surprised me because such gestures had become rare, almost ceremonial, as if he extended them only when his wife reminded him of duty. Still I accepted, thinking perhaps this was a chance to bridge the distance that had widened between us. I put on my best jacket, the same dark wool one I wore to Ellen's funeral, pressed a clean shirt, and brought along a pie I'd baked that morning. It had been Ellen's recipe, the kind she used to make for church socials, the kind that once made Mark beam when he was a boy. I thought, maybe foolishly, that a taste of the past could soften the edges of the present. When I arrived, their house loomed with that modern sterility, all sharp lines and glass, expensive yet somehow cold, as if no laughter had ever warmed the walls. My daughter-in-law, Michelle, greeted me at the door with a rehearsed smile that did not reach her eyes, a smile of obligation. The grandchildren, both teenagers now, barely looked up from their glowing phones to acknowledge me. They were polite in the way children are when instructed to be, but I felt immediately that I was a guest in a place where my presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. Mark, my son, came out from the kitchen carrying a glass of wine, dressed in a tailored shirt that made him look more like a businessman on a magazine cover than the boy I once taught to hammer nails into a fence post. He gave me a hug, quick and perfunctory, as though the gesture were an item to be checked off a list. We sat around the dining table, and conversation moved in predictable patterns, circling around Mark's work, Michelle's new business venture, the children's school achievements. I tried to join in, asking questions, but my words felt like stones dropped into a well, sinking without a ripple. When I began to tell a story about Ellen, about the first Thanksgiving we hosted when Mark was small, and how she had burned the turkey but saved the day with humor and grace, Mark cut me off with a glance, impatient, muttering, "Dad, you've told that story before." His tone was not cruel exactly, but dismissive, and the children smirked slightly, embarrassed by their grandfather's rambling. My chest tightened, and I forced a smile, pretending it did not sting. Dinner was served, steak with elaborate sides that looked like they had been arranged by a decorator more than a cook. Michelle poured wine into crystal glasses, carefully avoiding mine, and when I asked for just a small pour, she said gently, almost patronizingly, "Maybe just stick with water, Dad. You know how wine doesn't sit well with you at your age." I had never told her any such thing, and for a moment I wanted to protest, but the effort seemed too great. So I let it pass, though each small slight carved into me a little deeper. The grandchildren laughed at jokes I did not understand, references to shows or games foreign to me, and I found myself withdrawing into silence, chewing my food slowly, wondering why I had come. And then it happened. It was not shouted, nor was it whispered. It was spoken in the middle of a lull, in that careless, thoughtless way people reveal the truest things they think. Mark set down his fork, looked at me, and said, "Dad, you can't keep living out there on that farm, rattling around by yourself. You're just waiting to die. You should sell the place and move into a home where you'll be looked after properly." The words hit the table heavier than any dish, heavier than the wine glasses or the silverware. Michelle glanced at him but said nothing, and the grandchildren looked up for the first time with curiosity, as if this spectacle was more entertaining than their screens. I stared at him, unsure if I had heard correctly, though of course I had. Just waiting to die. He said it so casually, as though it were a reasonable observation, as though reducing my life to a prelude to death was simply the practical truth. I tried to form words to explain that I still worked, still read, still thought, that my life was not an empty hallway leading to the grave, but my voice trembled and caught in my throat. He continued unfazed, outlining how the farm was too much for me, how the money from selling it could ensure I had a comfortable room in one of those polished facilities where nurses changed sheets and calendars marked bingo nights. He spoke with the tone of a man presenting a business plan confident in its logic, dismissing sentiment as a weakness. I felt the heat rise in my face, not from shame, but from anger, though I tried to hide it. I said softly, "That farm is my life, Mark. It's where your mother and I built everything. It's where you grew up." He shrugged, slicing another piece of steak, replying, "Exactly, Dad. The past. You can't live in the past forever. We'll take care of everything when you're gone, but right now you're just clinging to it, wasting away out there." The silence after that stretched long and brittle. I looked at my grandchildren, hoping for a flicker of recognition, some defense of their grandfather, but they avoided my eyes, uncomfortable with the tension. Michelle cleared her throat and said something about dessert, but the words dissolved in the air. I forced myself to eat another bite, though my stomach had closed like a fist. Inside, I felt something shift, a fracture in the foundation of whatever remained between my son and me. He had spoken aloud the verdict he had carried in his heart, that I was finished, already gone in all but breath. I left early that night, making some excuse about needing rest, and drove back along the dark country roads with the headlights carving tunnels through the fields. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly they ached, but I could not loosen them. The words replayed again and again, just waiting to die. They echoed not only in my ears, but in my very bones, a cruel drumbeat telling me I was obsolete, unwanted, a ghost that had overstayed his welcome. I parked by the farmhouse and sat for a long time in the truck, staring at the outline of the barn against the night sky, wondering how the place that had once been filled with laughter and purpose now stood as a monument to solitude. That night I could not sleep. I walked the creaking floors, ran my hands over the furniture Ellen had chosen, stared at the faded curtains she once washed in spring sunshine. I thought about how easily my son had consigned me to death in his mind, how he spoke of me as if I were not there, as if I were already ashes scattered on the wind. Anger and grief twisted together until I felt almost ill. For the first time I wondered not whether I would die alone, but whether I had already been erased from the life of the only child I had. It was in that sleepless night that something hardened inside me. I realized that if I allowed his words to stand, if I accepted his judgment, then I truly would become what he declared me to be, a man simply waiting for the end. But I was not ready to surrender to that fate. I was not yet done, not yet broken, not yet incapable of acting. His cruelty, whether conscious or careless, had awakened something in me, something sharper than despair. He thought I was waiting to die. He would discover, sooner than he expected, that I was waiting for something else entirely. After that night at Mark's house, the air between us changed in a way that could not be smoothed over with polite phone calls or shallow visits. He had spoken aloud what he had long thought, and in doing so, he had stripped away the last fragile layer of courtesy that masked his contempt. The days that followed were heavy with that knowledge. I went about my routines on the farm, repairing a sagging gate, pruning the fruit trees, feeding the cats that lingered near the barn. But everything I touched felt different, as if my son's words had settled like dust over every object. I could not pick up a tool or walk across the field without hearing the echo of his voice, telling me I was just waiting to die. It was not death itself that haunted me. I had accepted that inevitability long ago, but the casual cruelty of being dismissed by my own flesh and blood, as though my existence were nothing more than a stubborn delay in his plans. Mark began visiting more frequently after that dinner, though his appearances were never framed as gestures of affection. Instead, he arrived with an air of inspection, as though he were checking the condition of a property he already believed to be his. He would circle the house, pointing out the peeling paint on the siding, the loose shingles on the roof, the weeds edging the driveway. "You can't keep up with this place, Dad," he would say, shaking his head like a disapproving landlord. Once he reached into my pocket and pulled out my truck keys, declaring that I should not be driving any more, claiming that it was unsafe for me to be on the road at my age. I protested weakly, saying I only drove to town for groceries or church, but he was firm, tossing the keys into his pocket with the confidence of someone who no longer believed my opinion mattered. "I'll drive you when you need it," he said, though we both knew what that meant, that my independence had been stolen in one careless gesture. The small humiliations accumulated like pebbles in my shoe, each one uncomfortable on its own, but together grinding me down with every step. He brought me groceries without asking what I wanted, stocking my shelves with food I did not care for, as if I were incapable of choosing for myself. He commented on the way I dressed, the slowness of my steps, the tremor in my hands when I poured coffee. To outsiders, his actions might have looked like concern, the dutiful son caring for an aging father. But beneath the surface there was a different truth. His so-called care was threaded with disdain, his every word laced with the conviction that I was incompetent, that my life was already over, and he was simply tidying up the remnants. The neighbors noticed the change, though they were too polite to speak directly of it. At church, one of the older women asked if I was getting enough help, her eyes darting toward Mark, who stood a few pews away with his family. Another neighbor stopped by the farm one afternoon and mentioned that Mark had been talking about how worried he was for me, how forgetful I had become, how I was struggling to manage. I felt a rush of heat in my face because I knew those were not observations. They were inventions, carefully planted seeds to build a narrative of decline. My son was not only taking away my independence in practice, he was eroding my reputation, painting me as a frail and forgetful old man, so that others would accept his decisions as necessary. It was at that point I began to realize that this was not merely about convenience or even misguided concern. This was a campaign, a deliberate effort to strip me of dignity, to prepare the ground for something larger. I remembered the way his eyes had lingered on the house, the way his questions always circled back to finances, the way Michelle had once joked, not entirely joking, that the farm was prime real estate. I began to suspect that my son's sudden interest in my welfare was not born of love, but of calculation. The more he convinced others that I was failing, the easier it would be for him to justify taking control of what I owned. One evening after he had left, I sat in the kitchen with a notebook and began to write down everything I observed, each slight, each confiscation, each untruth he spread. I listed the days he visited, the words he spoke, the things he took or changed. It felt strange at first, like a schoolboy keeping a diary, but the act gave me a sense of quiet strength. If he meant to diminish me with lies, then I would counter with the truth written in my own hand, undeniable evidence that I was still sharp, still capable of remembering, still in control of my thoughts. The notebook became a companion, a witness to the erosion of respect, and in its pages I began to see a pattern that confirmed what my instincts already told me. This was no longer the bond between father and son. It was a power struggle, and I was being cast in the role of the defeated old man long before the fight had even begun. The tension grew sharper during one particular visit when Mark brought Michelle and the children along. They sat in my living room, the same room where Ellen once placed flowers on the windowsill, where family photos still crowded the mantel. Michelle looked around with a faint curl of distaste, commenting on the dust, the outdated furniture, the smell of the wood stove. She asked casually if I had considered moving to a facility with modern comforts, where I wouldn't have to worry about upkeep or chores. Mark chimed in, saying that it would be better for everyone, that it would give him peace of mind knowing I was safe. I looked at my grandchildren, hoping for some spark of loyalty, but one of them, without looking up from his phone, said, "Mom," says Grandpa shouldn't be alone much longer. The words pierced me more deeply than Mark's had, because they revealed the quiet conversations happening behind closed doors, the way my son and his wife spoke of me not as family, but as a problem to be managed. That night, after they left, I walked through the house room by room, touching the walls, the tables, the photographs, as though anchoring myself to the life they wanted me to surrender. I thought of Ellen, of her laughter echoing in these rooms, of the countless meals we cooked together, of the nights we held hands in front of the fire when the wind howled outside. Could my son truly believe that I would abandon all this willingly, that I would trade memory and history for sterile hallways and scheduled activities? The insult was not only in his words, but in the arrogance of assuming I would have no say. The first escalation, then, was not one violent blow, but a steady tightening of the noose, the confiscated keys, the whispered lies, the staged concern. It was death by 1,000 cuts, each one small enough to be denied, but together forming a wound that would not heal. And as I endured them, I began to feel something new rising in me. Not only anger, but resolve. If my son wished to treat me as though I were already gone, then he would one day learn how wrong he was. For now, I endured, I kept my notebook, I bided my time. But deep inside, I began to understand that I was no longer simply defending my pride, I was preparing for a reckoning. The weeks after those small humiliations passed with an uneasy rhythm, and I tried to convince myself that I could endure them without breaking, that a father's patience must be infinite even when it is tested by his own son. But then came the evening when I walked into the living room and saw Mark bent over my desk, rifling through the drawers with a concentration that sent a jolt of cold through me. He did not hear me at first, and I watched from the doorway as he pulled out a folder, the one where I kept old bank statements, deeds, and the will Ellen and I had drafted years ago. His back was to me, his hands moving quickly, flipping through pages with the urgency of someone searching for proof of ownership. When he finally looked up and saw me, he did not startle, nor did he apologize. He simply closed the folder with a shrug and said, "You should really let me organize this stuff, Dad. You're not keeping up with it." The casualness of his tone enraged me more than if he had shouted, because it revealed that he no longer thought of me as the master of my own house, but as a doddering old man whose affairs could be rearranged at his. convenience. I asked him sharply what he was looking for, but he ignored the question, slipping the papers back into the drawer with an exaggerated patience, as if humoring a child. He said something about needing to make sure things were in order, so that when the time came, nothing would be left to chance. When the time came, he spoke of my death not as a distant eventuality, but as an imminent transaction, a matter of paperwork that he wished to have neatly tied. I felt my heart pound, not from fear of death, but from the dawning realization that my own son was not waiting for grief or mourning, but for possession, waiting for the day he could claim what he already believed belonged to him. That night, after he left, I sat at the kitchen table with the folder spread before me. My hands trembled slightly as I turned the pages, not from weakness, but from fury. I read over the will Ellen and I had written, remembering how carefully we had chosen the wording, how we had agreed that everything would pass to Mark, trusting that he would honor our memory and care for whatever remained. But now that trust seemed naive, almost reckless, because I could see in his eyes not gratitude, but hunger. He was not content to wait for the natural course of time. He wanted to hasten it, to frame me as incapable, so that he could take control while I still breathed. It was the first time I allowed myself to think of him not as my son, but as an adversary. That thought sat heavy in my chest, almost unbearable, because I still loved him, still saw in him the boy who once held my hand at the county fair, the boy who cried when his mother scolded him, the boy who used to climb into my lap when thunderstorms shook the windows. To think of him as an enemy felt like betraying those memories, but to deny it would be to blind myself to what was unfolding before me. The next escalation came only days later when he returned with a man he introduced as a friend from the city. The man wore a press suit and carried a briefcase, and though he called himself a social worker, his manner was more like that of an assessor, his eyes scanning the room with calculation. Mark explained that they were only there to check on me, to ensure that I was safe. But as the stranger asked me questions, what day it was, what medications I took, whether I ever forgot to eat or to lock the door, I realized this was no friendly visit. This was an evaluation, a performance stage to gather evidence that I was no longer competent. I answered every question clearly, holding his gaze with steady defiance, but I could feel Mark's eyes on me, waiting, hoping for a slip, a hesitation, a moment of confusion that he could later use as proof. When they left, I overheard Mark whisper to the man at the door, his voice low, but not low enough, "He's slipping. It's just not obvious yet." The words froze me in place because I understood then that he had already decided on the narrative, and he would bend every fact to fit it. To him my clarity was not resilience but temporary luck, a delay before the inevitable collapse he was counting on. It was not enough for him to inherit what I had. He needed to discredit me, to strip me of authority, to make the world believe that I was no longer capable of deciding for myself. That realization was the turning point, the midpoint of this slow descent from fatherhood into betrayal. It was no longer a question of whether my son respected me or whether he would care for me in my old age. It was now a matter of survival, of whether I would allow myself to be erased while still alive. For the first time I began to think not only of defense but of retaliation. I thought of the notebook where I had written my observations, of the evidence I could gather, of the allies I might find in lawyers or neighbors who still knew me as the man I was. I thought of the land, the house, the savings, everything Mark assumed would one day fall into his hands, and I felt a grim satisfaction in imagining ways to take that certainty from him, to make him realize too late that he had underestimated me. I sat by the window late into the night, watching the fields shimmer under the moonlight, and I whispered Ellen's name, asking silently if she would forgive me for what I was beginning to plan. For years I had lived quietly, enduring loneliness with resignation, telling myself that patience was a virtue. But now patience had become a weapon in the hands of my son, twisted into proof of weakness, and I knew I could not endure it any longer. Something had to break, and it would not be me. After the man with the briefcase left and the echoes of his condescending questions finally drained from the house, I told myself I would not be caught off guard again. Yet the days that followed unfolded like a lesson in how thoroughly a person can be cornered when someone younger, colder, and convinced of his own rightness, sets his jaw and decides that the time for patience has passed. It began with the mail, a small thing at first, the way small things often herald storms. Letters that had always arrived promptly began to come late, or not at all. And when I asked at the post office, the clerk, a woman who has known me since Ellen, taught Sunday school with her sister, said that my son had come in with a change of address form for my name to be added under his, claiming he would manage the household bills, so nothing slipped her through the cracks, and I felt the ground tilt. Because I knew I had not given permission, and I knew precisely what it meant when the stream of envelopes that tether a person to the stability of his life is quietly redirected. The bank followed close behind, a manager I like, a young man with polite manners and the decency to look embarrassed, called to ask if I still intended to add Mark as a co-signer to my accounts as we discussed last week. And when I told him there had been no such discussion, he coughed and described a visit in which my son had sat in his office, explaining that I was struggling, that it would be best if oversight were consolidated, that he, a dutiful son, would shoulder the burden, and as the manager's careful phrases skated over the difference between help and control, I felt the first fierce, clean spark of resolve that does not shout but hardens, and I told him no, not now, not ever, and asked that a note be placed on my file, that changes required my physical presence, and a passphrase I chose then and there, something only Ellen and I ever said, a bit of private weather between us that Mark could not guess, no matter how many drawers he rifled. When Mark arrived that weekend, he found the truck keys back on their hook. Because I had dug out the spare set he did not know existed, and he walked through the rooms as if taking inventory, pausing in the kitchen to toss a shut-off notice from the utility onto the table, a notice that startled me until I realized the autopay that had worked for years had been mysteriously canceled and a new online access created under an email address that was not mine. And when I pointed to the absurdity of it, he leaned on the counter with that weary superiority and asked me if I had forgotten to pay again, telling me gently that lapses were normal. At your stage, which almost made me laugh because it was then that the smell of gas reached us, faint but unmistakable, and he sprang to the stove to twist a knob. I knew I had not touched that day, scolding me for carelessness, while his fingers moved with a familiarity that told me precisely who had turned that burner without lighting it, not to harm me, perhaps, but to stage the scene that would later be relayed to neighbors and officials as proof that I could not be trusted in a house with appliances in flame. The next morning, a patrol car rolled down the lane, and 2 officers stepped onto the porch for a wellness check requested by a concerned family member. And though they were courteous and left satisfied after I offered them coffee and recited details of the week's headlines with more clarity than either of them expected, I watched their cruiser pause at the road to meet Mark's SUV, and I saw him gesture toward the house with the air of a man making a point that would not need to be made again. The escalation acquired a public face when Mark declared we were going to brunch in town and steered me, with practiced cheerfulness, not to the cafe where the ladies from church gossip about grandchildren, but to a building with a cheerful name, and a receptionist who greeted me not as a diner but as an intake. The clipboard already prepared with my birth date and insurance, a tidy little suite already labeled Mr. Caldwell in dry erase marker as if I were luggage routed by barcode, and when I said we were leaving, Mark adopted that soft tone people use for frightened animals and tried to usher me into a tour. It was only when I raised my voice enough that other families looked up and the receptionist's smile trembled that he stopped, and on the drive home he spoke without heat. A banker enumerating options, explaining that a temporary stay would allow them to assess my needs and build a case for coverage, and if I refused, he would be forced regrettably to consider guardianship for my own good. I said very little because sometimes silence is the only currency that retains value when the other party has decided to devalue every word you say. But inside the ledger of my patience a line was drawn that could not be erased. Evidence of motive arrived not as a confession, but as a collage that any farmer could read the way he reads clouds. A slick brochure that fell from the pocket of Mark's coat when he draped it over my chair. A brochure from Meadow Ridge Development. with artists' renderings of brownstone-style townhomes and a map that overlaid my north fields with a smiling cul-de-sac. A schedule scribbled in Mark's tight hand that included a lunch with MRD- final offer if POA. A stray voicemail picked up on my answering machine when his phone connected by accident during one of his visits. A tinny voice saying the market would cool if the county delayed the rezoning another quarter, and it would be cleaner once we have control. And a checkbook register I glimpsed when Michelle, in a moment of impatience, flipped through her purse and revealed overdraft fees marching across the page like ants. The last piece came from the most unexpected quarter, my grandson, the quieter of the two, who lingered after the others went to the truck and asked awkwardly why Grandpa couldn't live closer to town for a while, because Mom said the buyers were waiting and Dad was underwater and everybody would sleep better once the deal closed, and I thanked him for his honesty, because children do not lie in the complicated way adults do. They repeat what the household air is full of. When the papers came from the courthouse, a petition for temporary guardianship with affidavits attached and a doctor's note, I recognized from last year's checkup clipped out of context, so that a mention of mild hearing loss read like a warning of cognitive decline. I understood that we had moved from skirmishes to a siege. The affidavits were stacked with the same adjectives, forgetful and unsafe and disoriented, a chorus conducted by someone who believed repetition could make a description true, and included were statements from two neighbors whose names hurt me too. See? Because I knew them to be kind people who had simply been told that I left the stove on and wandered at night and missed bill payments, and in the absence of any other story they signed what was set before them. There was a hearing date not far off, and for a moment at the kitchen table I felt the cold hand of fear on my shoulder, because I have seen what guardianship can do when a judge, harried and trusting, grants a petition and the keys to a person's life pass into hands that have already demonstrated their hunger. Fear, however, is a poor counselor unless it drives a man directly to the place where counsel is given. And so I went to the bank not to plead, but to prepare, opening a safe deposit box and placing inside it the notebook I had begun. A thumb drive, a neighbor's boy, helped me fill with scans of deeds and statements and a small digital recorder I'd bought in town. Nothing elegant, just a cheap device that could hold long, steady rivers of conversation if I set it discreetly on a shelf or slid it under a napkin during a kitchen talk that began in false warmth and ended, as they all now ended, in veiled threats. I made an appointment with my old doctor, a woman with a direct gaze whose husband I once talked to tractors with at the county fair, and I asked her to test me thoroughly, not just for the sake of paper, but because I wanted the mirror of a profession that did not owe my son anything to reflect me honestly. The tests were long and a little humiliating in their way, naming animals and subtracting numbers and recalling lists, but at the end she patted my arm and said that if age had robbed me of speed, it had not stolen my judgment, and she would write exactly that. In the midst of this, I also visited a lawyer whose name I knew not, because I had retained her before, but because I remembered a skinny high school girl who used to help her father stack hay on the Henderson place, a girl I once drove to a scholarship interview when her pickup died on the county road, and now she sat behind a desk with her diploma on the wall and listened without interrupting, her pen motionless, her face the kind of still that means someone is thinking at a speed the rest of us cannot see. She asked precise questions, not about how hurt I felt, which she could tell anyway, but about dates and documents and who had access to what. And when she had a map of the battlefield in her head, she outlined in that same calm voice the difference between letting a fire burn and building a fire break. We would file a response to the petition with the doctor's evaluation attached. We would notify the court that any attempt to change my mail, utilities, or banking without written consent constituted interference. We would place the farm under a trust of my choosing, so that, if something did happen to me, the trustees I named, not Mark, would manage it according to instructions we drafted now while the ink was mine and the signature my own. And if I wished we could alter the will, Ellen and I wrote in The Era, when we trusted a boy who was no longer present in the man who had replaced him, shifting the fate of the land to a purpose I could die with peace about, whether that meant conservation easement, a scholarship fund for farm kids who did not have city connections, or a trust for the grandchildren that would flower only when their hands were old enough to hold responsibility without crushing it. If this sounds like the beginning of my revenge, it was not yet that. It was the laying of foundation stones in a storm while the wind tried to tear the plans from my hands. Because Mark was not content to let the filings speak, he doubled the pressure as the hearing neared, arriving unannounced with a handyman who measured the doorways and talked about safety rails as if the house had already been certified as a facility carrying pill organizers and a whiteboard where he wrote reminders in block letters as if I were a lodger who needed instructions to breathe, and he took my phone to simplify your plan and returned it without several contacts, including the number of the lawyer and the doctor, and when I noticed and confronted him, he shrugged and said he was only removing duplicates, a lie so lazy I think he expected me to accept it out of fatigue. He visited the church and told the pastor, a good man whose heart is bigger than his patience for conflict, that I was struggling with grief finally catching up to me, and so a family meeting was convened in the fellowship hall where Mark and Michelle and the pastor urged me to consider how much easier life would be if I allowed others to help, and though the pastor meant well, the word help in my son's mouth was simply the velvet lining of a shackle, and I left that meeting with the odd sensation of having been prayed over and preyed upon at the same time. On the eve of the hearing, after I had spent the afternoon gathering the papers my lawyer requested, and the evening walking the fence line with the recorder in my pocket, capturing the solitary fact of my own voice, naming the landmarks that had defined my life, Mark arrived with a new tactic that told me he understood, at some level, that the contest was slipping from simple narratives to the terrain of proof. He brought Michelle and the children and suggested we eat together, and for a time the conversation was almost normal, a staged normalcy that felt like theater. But then he asked me to sign a stack of forms, he said related to insurance updates and emergency contacts, and when I lifted the top sheet, the words durable power of attorney sat there in print, large enough to be undeniable, and I set the pen down and looked at my son, really looked, and for the first time allowed the knowledge to appear naked between us that he had crossed from impatience into a kind of theft that requires witnesses and paperwork and a performance of concern. I told him I would not sign, and the mask slipped. He did not shout, because people like Mark think shouting is vulgar, but he spoke in a low voice that carried, and he informed me that I was being unreasonable, that I was endangering myself and embarrassing him, that the judge would see it his way because judges live in the same world he does, a world where competence is measured in portfolios and the speed of a man's stride. That night I slept in fits and starts, but each time I woke I felt less afraid and more clear. And before dawn I sat at the table and wrote a letter to Ellen in the only way I know to speak to the dead, telling her that the boy we loved had forgotten what we taught, that he had not merely failed to honor age, but had tried to strip it for parts. And I told her also that I would not let the land we bled into become a paved loop for strangers' cars, and that if I was, as he said, just waiting to die, then I would choose the manner of my waiting and the legacy that followed, even if it cost me the last thin cords that still connected me to my son. When the sun came up, I poured coffee, put the letter in the safe deposit box next to the recorder and the notebook, tucked the doctor's letter into a folder with the lawyer's filings, and buttoned my jacket. The second escalation had taken everything soft from this quarrel. There would be no reconciliation at a kitchen table, no compromise that preserved both pride and peace. He wanted guardianship and the keys it provided. I wanted dignity and the right to decide the fate of what I had built. Only one of us would walk out of the courthouse with what he wanted, and for the first time since Ellen died I felt the old steadiness in my hands, the steadiness of a man who knows the weather is turning and that he has done everything that can be done before the first hard rain. The morning of the hearing I woke before the alarm, not because I was restless, but because something old and steady in me had taken the reins, the same feeling I used to get when a storm line showed itself on the horizon, and there were rows to finish before the first hard drops hit the tin roof. I shaved with the careful patience of a man who understands his face is the last territory he truly governs, buttoned the good shirt Ellen liked on me, tucked the notebook into my jacket with the doctor's letter, the bank manager's affidavit, the printouts from the post office, and the little recorder that had captured more truth than Mark ever meant to let slip. The courthouse smelled of dust and lemon cleaner, and the hallway hummed with ordinary tragedies. But when my lawyer, no longer the hay-baling girl, but a woman with a calm that could level rough fields, touched my elbow and said, "We're ready," the noise faded, and I walked into the room that my son expected to be the end of my authority, and knew, in the marrow of my bones, that it would be the beginning of his education. The judge was a man with good eyes and a tired posture. He looked at Mark first because the world trains us to look at the young and the glossy, and my son performed the role he'd rehearsed, concerned, burdened, noble in a way that would photograph. Well, speaking of late bills and wandering and the stove that had been left on, the mail that had piled up, the risk of driving, the kindness of a temporary guardianship to protect an aging father from himself. He did not look at me while he said these things, which was his first mistake, because a lie gains strength from eye contact. It withers when you speak past the person it's meant to bury. My lawyer did not begin with speeches. She asked the court to swear me in and invited me in that steady voice to tell the judge what I did each day, what medicines I took, what I read, what I paid, and how, and why the keys were missing from their hook when my son left the last time. I spoke the way a man testifies when he has planted and harvested in the same soil for half a century, slowly enough to be understood, precisely enough to be checked. Then she called witnesses not to the stand but to the paper. The letter from my physician stating that while my joints complained and my hearing needed help, my judgment was intact. The affidavit from the bank manager documenting my son's attempt to add himself as co-signer, and the passphrase I set to prevent it. The postal form for a change of address filed without my consent and rescinded when I presented identification. The utility account logs showing an online user created from an email. That was not mine. On the same afternoon, Mark helped me with my computer. And the photograph I had taken of the stove knob after his scolding, with the time stamp that placed him in my kitchen minutes before the accident he reported to neighbors. She asked permission to play a short audio clip, and the judge nodded, leaning back as my kitchen filled the courtroom with the scrape of a chair and Mark's voice, lowered but confident, telling a man he called Pete that once we have control, the Northfields go first, Meadow Ridge is ready, and the county is soft on rezoning right now, followed by that small, satisfied chuckle I have heard since he was 10 and thought he'd gotten away with something. The room changed temperature. I could feel it, like a front blowing through. My son's lawyer tried to claim it was out of context, idle chatter, a misinterpretation, but context arrived in the shape of a business card the clerk handed up. The social worker who had evaluated me was not licensed in this state because he was not a social worker at all. He was a placement consultant on retainer to the very developer whose brochure had fallen from my son's coat. My lawyer did not gloat. She let the paper do the talking and then, as if laying down a final fence post, submitted the trust documents we had executed just after sunrise that morning. The Ellen Caldwell Farm Trust, irrevocable, with the conservations. Easement on the north and east fields, the home place to be leased long-term to our neighbor at favorable rates. Scholarship provisions for farm kids to learn something that would let them stay or go as they chose, and bequests for my grandchildren, to unlock only when they were old enough to be more than extensions of their parents' appetites. The trustees were named with care, our pastor's wife, a school superintendent, and my lawyer, people who had no reason to fear my son or flatter him. Mark read the first page and went pale in a way I had not seen since he broke his arm falling from the hayloft and realized bravado would not set the bone. When it was his turn again, he tried to pivot to love, to the language of sons who only want to help, to the tragedies of aging and the burdens of caretaking and the embarrassment of a father who cannot admit he needs support. And there was a moment when I almost pitied him, because I recognized the instinct to find softer ground after your chosen field turns to swamp under your feet. But the judge had heard enough. He spoke gently to me, asked whether I understood the trust, whether I had signed it freely, whether I wished to designate a medical proxy who was not my son, and I answered each question with the same clear patience I once used to teach Mark to tie a fisherman's knot, and then the gavel did not bang so much as it settled, and the petition for temporary guardianship was denied with language as plain as fence boards. Insufficient evidence of incapacity, credible evidence of interference, and order. That my mail, utilities, and accounts were not to be altered without my written consent. A directive that keys, checkbooks, and personal effects taken from my home be returned within 24 hours, and a warning that further misrepresentations to the court would invite sanctions that do not look good in any light. Michelle, who had sat rigid as a bolt the whole time, reached for Mark's arm and missed because he was already standing, already facing a future he had not planned for. I did not look away. This was not triumph, and it was not vengeance. Not yet. It was the end of a siege. In the corridor he caught up to me with that tight smile he learned in boardrooms, said that I had humiliated him, that we could have handled this privately, that I had overreacted and poisoned the well, that I had deprived his children, my grandchildren, of their rightful legacy, and while he spoke, my lawyer stood a respectful distance away, and the people from other courtrooms flowed around us like a river parting around a stubborn rock. I told him quietly that legacies are not rights, they are responsibilities entrusted by the dead to the living, and he had shown me clearly what he would do with a trust too large for his hands. He said something then I will not forget, not because of its cruelty, but because of its honesty. "You are going to die, Dad. Maybe not today, but soon. And all this," he gestured at the papers, the doors, the flags and seal, "won't change that." I surprised us both by smiling, not because death is funny, but because truth freed from malice can be a blessing. "Of course I am," I said, "and you are too, son. The difference is whether a man spends the days left to him bowing to fear or standing where his feet means something." I told him the trust was not a punishment but a promise, to Ellen, to the land, to the kids he had taught to count dollars faster than blessings, and that there was still a place set for him at my table if he ever learned to sit without calculating what the chair was worth. He called me sanctimonious and turned away, and for the first time in years I let him go without an urge to call him back. On the steps outside the courthouse, the wind off the square lifted the edge of my jacket like a hand. My lawyer asked if I wanted to ride home, and I said I would walk a bit. There is a feeling a man earns only a few times in a lifetime, the sensation of weight redistributing after you have shouldered something too heavy for too long, and I wanted to feel the ground cleanly under my feet. A deputy caught up to return the keys that had already been surrendered at the clerk's window. The small ring chimed softly in my palm like coins from a church plate, ordinary and holy all at once. On Main Street I passed the hardware store where the owner leaned on a broom and pretended not to have seen my son's car peel away, and I tipped my hat to him as if everything were ordinary, because that is the luxury of dignity restored. It requires no trumpet. At the corner I paused and looked through the glass of the cafe where the pastor sat with the superintendent who had become a trustee. Their heads were bent together in what I knew was not gossip, but gratitude, that something hard had been done. Without bitterness, and I felt Ellen's hand on my sleeve the way I sometimes do when a choice lands right. Mark had told me months ago that I was just waiting to die. It turns out I was waiting for this morning, for the moment when I could say with my chin level and my heart steady that I had chosen the manner of my going and the fate of what I would leave behind, and that no son, no matter how polished, no matter how practiced, could cheat me of that simple human right. I did not celebrate that day with noise or company. I went home, hung my jacket on the chair Ellen used to claim at supper, set the kettle on, and stood by the window while the fields eased from late afternoon gold into the dusky blue that makes the fence line look like a sentence finally coming to its period, and in that ordinary quiet I felt the strange, weightless certainty that the story my son had tried to write for me had been gently, irrevocably taken from his hands. The orders were signed, the keys returned, the trust recorded. The north and east acres were already marked on a surveyor's map with the light green wash of a conservation easement, and my neighbor, a steady man with a patient laugh, came by that evening to shake my hand about the lease on the home place, promising to keep the soil rotated the way Ellen liked, and to leave the lilac hedge alone, because she had planted it with her own small trowel and a stubbornness that beat back every rock in. That ribbon of earth. The cat wound herself around my boots as if she, too, approved of paperwork and boundaries and human beings who finally remember the difference between ownership and stewardship. I poured tea, opened the kitchen window to let the early summer air move through the house, and wrote 3 letters on heavy paper in the long, careful script the nuns once taught me with rulers and praise. One to the church treasurer, enclosing the first check for the scholarship fund in Ellen's name with a note that preference should be given to farm kids who had dirt under their nails and a book under their arm. One to the school superintendent, now a trustee, asking if she would organize essays from the seniors about what they would do with land if it could. Never be paved, and one to Mark, not to gloat or reopen wounds, but to tell him in plain words that I hoped he would someday understand, that I had not chosen revenge so much as I had chosen fidelity, that if he ever wished to walk the field road, with me in silence I would set out 2 cups on the table, and we would see what the wind decided to say. Days took on the shape of work again, not the hard-throated kind that breaks the back, but the small, exacting work that tells a man he is still trusted by his own life. I cleaned tools and put them away with the reverence of a sacristan. I sorted Ellen's recipe cards into a tin and tried twice to bake the molasses bread. She always scolded for refusing to rise, laughing out loud when my first loaf sat there like a stubborn stone, and the second finally ballooned up as if she had stepped into the kitchen and whispered a correction at the yeast. I mended the screen on the porch and oiled the hinges that had been complaining for years because I had been too sad or too tired to listen. The phone rang less, which was a blessing, and when it did ring, it was in the old ways I understood. The pastor asking if I could come by to look at a broken latch, a young mother from down the road wanting to borrow a ladder, the bank manager, calling me sir in the careful voice of a man who has seen a storm pass near a house he cares about and is grateful it bent the trees but did not take the roof. There were costs, of course, because truth always presents its invoice. Some people from town who, like their stories neat, chose the version where I was the difficult father and Mark the put-upon son, and for a while I felt their eyes do that quick. Slide away when I entered the diner, but the waitress with the chipped wedding ring kept pouring my coffee with the same generosity as before, and by, the more patient souls understood that you can love your child and still bar your door against him if he insists on arriving with a wrecking crew. Once, near sundown, a car I recognized slowed at the mouth of the lane and did not turn in. I watched the shape of my son's silhouette hold there for a long, undecided minute, as if memory and appetite were wrestling in the same body, and then the signal blinked and the car moved on, and though my throat tightened, I did not curse or pray. I simply stood and accepted that sometimes the mercy you can offer a child is distance, which is another way of saying you believe he might yet learn something without you watching him fail. The grandchildren were quiet thunder on the horizon. Weeks later a plain envelope arrived addressed in a careful hand that I guessed belonged to the older one, and inside was a note that said only, "Grandpa, I read the trust documents online, and the part about keeping the lilacs made me cry. I remember Grandma's hands. Thank you for taking care of the place she loved." And there was no return address, only a pressed leaf folded into the paper like a small green oath. So I set the note in the cedar box with Ellen's rosary and did not expect more, because a grandfather's heart should be as patient as the weather and as unassuming as a fence post that does its job whether or not anyone thanks it. In town I began to sit some mornings at the library's long table with a basket of apples and a sign that said, "Ask me how to fix something," and boys with shy shoulders and girls with bold eyes brought in lamps and bicycles, and once a music stand with a broken collar, and I showed them how to hold a screwdriver square and how to know when enough force is enough. And sometimes they asked why my hands shook when I reached too far, and I told them without embarrassment that old age is a wind that lives in the wrists, and we laughed together and the lamp lit, and the librarian put another apple in my basket when she saw my smile settle into the quiet kind that does not need an audience. On Sundays I sat in our pew, a pew that now belonged to no one and everyone, and when the hymn came, that Ellen loved, I sang, not to the ceiling, but to the empty space beside me where her shoulder used to press into mine, and I discovered that grief, when finally respected, stops trying to devour and begins to accompany, which is a softer, more bearable habit. Afterward, the pastor's wife, who knows more than she says, told me that the first essay for the scholarship was about a girl who wanted to plant milkweed along ditch banks so monarchs would have a map again, and I said, that sounded like a gospel to me. Summer moved toward harvest, and with it came the slow, satisfying procession of consequences I had chosen. Survey stakes became signage about prairie restoration. The lease check arrived and went out again to pay for fence and seed, and 4 pairs of work gloves for kids from the senior class who wanted hours and a place to put their hands. A letter from the court clerk informed me, in language dry as a field in August, that certain misrepresentations would not be tolerated in future petitions, which is bureaucratic for, "We see you now," and I folded it and put it away without triumph. Every so often, when I walked the field road at dusk, I would remember the sentence my son offered me like a verdict, just waiting to die, and I would measure it against the day I had just lived, a day with tools in it and bread and a note from a child, and a fence mended and a sky so wide it made nonsense of small ambitions, and I would understand that he had been only half right. I am waiting, yes, as every creature does, but what I am waiting for is not an ending to relieve anyone's impatience. I am waiting for the right time to leave behind a place in better order than I found it, for the milkweed to take, for the lilacs to root deeper, for a boy who is now a man to remember the sound of a father saying his name, not as an accusation, but as a blessing, and if that remembering never comes, then still the land will keep faith, and so will I.